The padlock was the size of a human fist and looked like it cost more than my first car. It sat there, mocking me, gleaming in the morning sun, shackling the two sides of the wrought iron gate together with the kind of permanence usually reserved for bank vaults, nuclear silos, or the diary of a teenager with trust issues. All I wanted to do was let my golden retriever, Buster, take a dump on the grass. That's it. That was the mission. It was 6:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time when reasonable people are either sleeping or crying into their coffee, not engaging in psychological warfare with inanimate objects. "Well, buddy," I muttered, looking down at Buster, who was vibrating with the kinetic energy of 1,000 unchased squirrels. "Looks like the fun police have struck again." Buster whined, a high-pitched sound that translated roughly to, "Father, my bladder is full of justice and urine. Please open the portal." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small silver key that I had. Paid $50 to replace just last month. I jammed it into the keyhole. It didn't fit. Of course it didn't fit. I tried to wiggle it, applying that desperate, denial-fueled jiggle that everyone does when technology fails them, hoping that maybe if I just vibrated my hand fast enough, the atoms would align and the lock would pop open out of sheer pity. Nothing. It was solid, hardened steel. I took a step back and really looked at the gate. Hanging zip-tied to the black iron bars was a freshly laminated sign. It was printed on bright, aggressive yellow paper, the kind that screams, "Look at me, I have authority." Notice: Park closed for maintenance until further notice. HOA board. I squinted through the bars. The Oak Creek Community Park lay beyond, bathed in the golden light of dawn. The grass was manicured to within an inch of its life. The walking paths were swept clean. The playground equipment looked sturdy enough to survive a nuclear blast. There wasn't a single construction vehicle, a single shovel, or even a lonely traffic cone in sight. The only thing maintained in there was the silence. "Maintenance," I said aloud, tasting the lie on my tongue. It tasted like toner ink and HOA pretension. "You too, huh?" I jumped, nearly dropping my useless key. I spun around to see Dave from 3 houses down shuffling up the sidewalk. Dave was a good guy, mostly because he never complained about my lawn, and once lent me a pressure washer without asking when he'd get it back. He was holding a leash attached to a pug that looked like it was struggling to breathe just by existing. "Morning, Dave," I said, gesturing vaguely at the yellow sign. "Did you know about this? Apparently the grass is undergoing surgery." Dave snorted, scratching his stomach. He was wearing a bathrobe over sweatpants, a look I respected immensely. "Maintenance my ass, Jack. I saw the email blast go out at midnight. Linda sent it." "Midnight?" I looked back at the sign. "She laminated this at midnight?" "You know Linda," Dave said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She probably has a laminator next to her bed. She says the insurance premiums are going up because of unauthorized usage, meaning she saw those teenagers playing frisbee last week and decided joy is a liability." I felt the familiar heat rising in my chest. It wasn't just anger. It was the specific, prickly irritation that comes from living in a homeowners association managed by people who peaked as hallway monitors in middle school. We paid $400 a month for the privilege of living here. That money went to landscaping, snow removal, and apparently padlocks designed to keep us out of the property we paid for. "Unauthorized usage," I repeated, watching Buster sadly sniff the bottom of the gate. "Dave, it's a park. The only thing you can do in it is use it. What are we supposed to do? Just look at it from the street like it's a museum exhibit? According to the email," Dave said, leaning in. "There's a concern about turf degradation. She wants the grass to rest." "Rest?" I laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "It's Kentucky bluegrass, Dave, not a marathon runner with a torn ACL. It doesn't need rest. It needs to be walked on." Dave shrugged, his pug wheezing in agreement. "Look, Jack, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just saying, the gate is locked. She changed the locks. My key doesn't work either. I guess we're walking the perimeter today." I looked up the hill, toward the largest house in the cul-de-sac. It was a monstrosity of beige stucco and aggressive landscaping, the kind of house that looked like it would call the cops on you for parking slightly crooked. In the second-story window, the master bedroom, I saw a glint. Sunlight reflecting off glass. I squinted. The curtains twitched. I could see the outline of a person standing there. And not just standing, watching. She had binoculars. I was 90% sure she had binoculars. "She's watching us, Dave," I said, keeping my voice level. "She's up there right now, drinking herbal tea and getting off on the fact that we can't get in." Dave didn't even look up. "Don't make eye contact, Jack. It only encourages her. If she knows you see her, she'll cite you for aggressive loitering or something." "I'm not loitering. I'm blocked from entry." "Come on," Dave said, tugging on his pug. "Let's go. It's not worth it. You know how the board gets. You fight them, and suddenly your trash cans are non-compliant, and your mailbox is the wrong shade of eager white." Dave started walking away, his defeat absolute. I watched him go, a broken man in a bathrobe. Then I looked back at the gate. This wasn't just about the park. If it were just the park, I'd drive 5 minutes to the city playground. No, this was about the principle. It was about the slow, suffocating encroachment of petty tyranny. First, they told me I couldn't park my truck in my own driveway overnight because it was commercial. It had a rack on the top. Then they told me my Christmas lights were up too early. It was December 1st. Now they were locking up the green space because Linda, the supreme overlord of the Oak Creek Estates, decided that grass was more important than people. I rattled the gate again. The hinges groaned. Wait. I stopped rattling. I leaned in closer. The lock was impressive. Truly it was. It was a masterclass in security. It bound the two center bars together in an unbreakable embrace. But my eyes drifted to the side, to where the heavy iron gate connected to the brick pillars. The hinges. They were massive, decorative iron hinges. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. The gate opened inward, into the park. But because of the way the brick pillars were constructed, the hinge pins were located on the outside. On the street side, Sparky Pete, a contractor buddy of mine, had once told me over beers that 90% of fences are built by people who understand aesthetics but don't understand security. "If you can see the hinge," Pete had said, gesturing with a chicken wing, "it's not a wall, Jack. It's a door that just hasn't been asked politely to open yet." I reached out and touched the top hinge. It was painted black, coated in layers of weatherproofing, but underneath, it was just metal. A pin sitting in a sleeve. Welded? Maybe. But probably just capped. I looked back up at Linda's window. The binoculars were still there. She was probably logging the exact duration of my stare down. She thought she had won. She thought that by controlling the key, she controlled the gate. She forgot that a gate is just a collection of parts. I gave a little wave to the window. It was a cheerful wave. A neighborly wave. The kind of wave that says, "I hope your tea is hot and your arrogance is comforting, because I am about to ruin your whole week." "Come on, Buster," I said, turning away from the gate. "We've got errands to run." Buster looked at the park one last time, let out a huff of disappointment, and trotted after me. He didn't know it yet, but he was going to get his walk, and I was going to get my satisfaction. I didn't go home immediately. I walked the long way around the block, letting Buster do his business on the strip of grass by the county road, which I'm sure technically belonged to the highway department, but at least the highway department didn't have a newsletter. My mind was racing. I needed to be smart about this. If I just smashed the lock, that was vandalism. Destruction of HOA property. Linda would have the police at my door before the dust settled, and she'd be right. I couldn't damage the lock. I couldn't damage the gate structure. But maintenance? The sign said maintenance. I pulled out my phone and opened the HOA bylaws app. Yes, there was an app. They made us download it last year. I searched for gate. Section 4.2. Maintenance of common elements. The association shall be responsible for the maintenance, repair, and replacement of the common elements. However, emergency repairs to mitigate safety hazards may be authorized. I scrolled down. Section 8.1. Nuisance. No owner shall cause or allow any condition that renders the common elements unsafe or unusable. Unsafe. I thought about those hinges. They looked stiff, rusty, maybe. If a heavy iron gate has rusty hinges, that's a safety hazard. It could seize up. It could fall. Really, a responsible resident would ensure that those hinges were in top working order. And if the current hinges were, say, deemed defective, they would need to be removed for inspection. I got back to my house, put Buster inside, and went straight to my garage. I stood there, hands on my hips, looking at my tool wall. I had a hammer. I had a screwdriver set. I had a drill that I used, exclusively to hang pictures that were slightly crooked. I did not have what I needed. I needed heavy artillery. I needed noise. I needed sparks. I grabbed my phone and dialed. "Yo," a voice answered on the second ring. It sounded like he was currently inside a jet engine. "Pete," I yelled over the background noise. "Jack, hang on." There was a clattering sound, the whine of a saw dying down, and then silence. "All right, I can hear you. What's up? Your water heater explode again?" "No, Pete, I have a consultation question." "Consultation? That sounds expensive. I charge in whiskey." "I can do whiskey. Listen, I've got a wrought iron gate, heavy duty, brick pillars. The hinges are on the outside." "Amateurs," Pete scoffed immediately. "Let me guess. You got locked out?" "Something like that. Hypothetically, if someone wanted to remove those hinges, how hard would it be?" "Depends. Are they welded caps or screw caps?" "Painted over? Hard to tell." "If they're welded, you need an angle grinder, a cutoff wheel. Slice the top of the pin, pop it out with a punch. If the whole hinge is welded to the plate, well, you just slice the weld. 5 minutes work if you know what you're doing. 3 hours and a trip to the ER if you don't." "I need to borrow an angle grinder, Pete." There was a pause on the line. "Jack, the last time you borrowed a power tool, you stapled your sleeve to the drywall." "That was a staple gun, and it was a faulty trigger. This is for community service. I need the big one, the one you use to cut rebar." "You planning a heist, Jack?" "No, I'm planning a renovation. I'll be over in 20 minutes. I hung up. I could feel the adrenaline starting to pump. This was stupid. This was petty. This was exactly the kind of thing a grown man with a mortgage and a cholesterol problem should avoid. But then I remembered the sign. Park closed. I remembered Linda's curtains twitching. I remembered the smugness of that padlock. I wasn't just a man anymore. I was a force of nature. I was the spirit of liberty. I was a guy with a truck and a grudge. I drove to Pete's shop, a corrugated metal shed on the edge of town that smelled of ozone and sawdust. Pete was there, looking like a wizard of industry in welding goggles and a jumpsuit covered in grease stains. "So," Pete said, leaning against a workbench covered in metal shavings. "The HOA finally pushed you over the edge?" "They locked the park, Pete, with a padlock the size of a melon." "And you're gonna cut the lock?" "No," I said, tapping my temple. "That's property damage. The lock is fine. The lock is a perfectly good piece of machinery. I'm going to remove the hinges. Technically, I'm disassembling the gate to inspect the friction coefficient of the rotation mechanism." Pete stared at me for a long second. Then he burst out laughing. It was a loud, booming laugh that shook the tools on the wall. "I love it. Malicious compliance with a side of industrial sparks. All right, come here." He walked over to a shelf and pulled out a yellow case. He opened it to reveal a DeWalt angle grinder that looked heavy enough to kill a man. It had a cord thick enough to jumpstart a tank. "This here is the Excalibur of metal removal," Pete said reverently. "Diamond-tipped cutoff wheel. It'll eat through iron like it's butter. But Jack, listen to me. This thing spins at 11,000 RPM. It doesn't care if it cuts metal or bone. Wear the gloves, wear the goggles, and for the love of God, brace yourself." "I will. And catch the gate," Pete added. "When you cut that second hinge, gravity takes over. That gate weighs probably 300 pounds. If it falls on you, you're going to be flatter than a pancake." "I'll bring chocks." "Good man." Pete handed me the case, plus a full face shield and a pair of leather gloves that went up to my elbows. "Rent is a bottle of Jameson. And if you get arrested, you stole this from my truck." "Deal." I drove back to the neighborhood. It was getting toward noon now. The sun was high. The neighborhood was quiet. Most people were at work. But not Linda. Linda didn't work. Linda's full-time job was making sure nobody else enjoyed their life. I parked my truck right in front of the park entrance. I didn't hide. I didn't sneak. I backed it up so the tailgate was facing the gate. I lowered the tailgate. I laid out my tools like a surgeon preparing for an operation. Extension cord, check. Wooden blocks to prop up the gate, check. Safety gloves, check. Face shield, check. The grinder. I plugged the extension cord into the outlet in the back of my truck. Thank you, Ford, for the onboard generator. I picked up the grinder. It felt heavy, powerful. I walked up to the gate. I looked at the padlock. It was still there, looking smug. "You keep that gate closed, little buddy," I whispered to the lock. "You do your job. I'm just going to work around you." I wedged the wooden blocks under the bottom of the gate to support the weight. Then I put on the face shield. The world turned a slightly dim plastic yellow. I looked up at Linda's house. I saw the curtain move. She was there. She was watching. I squeezed the trigger. The grinder roared to life. It wasn't a hum. It was a scream. A mechanical banshee wail that shattered the suburban peace. I stepped up to the top hinge. The sound was deafening. A fountain of bright orange sparks erupted from the metal, shooting 10 feet into the air, cascading down like a beautiful industrial firework display. I could smell the iron burning. I felt the vibration rattling my teeth. It was glorious. I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Doors were opening down the street. People were coming out. Not to stop me, but to see what the hell was making a noise like a jet plane crashing. I pressed harder. The wheel bit deep. The paint smoked and bubbled. The steel groaned. And then, clunk. The top pin was severed. The hinge bracket popped loose. I stopped the grinder. The silence that rushed back in was sudden and heavy. Smoke drifted around me. "Hey!" I turned. Linda was on her front porch. She was wearing a floral muumuu and holding a phone to her ear. She was screaming, but from this distance, she looked like a mime performing anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice shrill enough to crack glass. I lifted my face shield. "Maintenance, Linda," I yelled back, cheerful and loud. "Just doing some maintenance. Don't worry, I'm an insured resident." "I'm calling the police." "You do that." I gave her a thumbs up. "Safety first." I flipped the shield back down. I bent down to the bottom hinge. The audience was growing. Dave was on his lawn, eating a bagel and watching with wide eyes. Mrs. Higgins from next door had come out with her watering can, but she was watering her driveway because she was staring at me. I revved. The grinder again. More sparks, more noise, more beautiful, destructive progress. I cut through the bottom pin. It took longer this time. The angle was awkward, but I was motivated by the sight of Linda sprinting down her driveway, phone pressed to her face, pointing at me with her free hand like she was casting a spell. The metal gave way. I killed the power. The gate groaned. It was now completely detached from the pillars. It was held up only by my wooden blocks and the fact that it was balanced. Linda arrived at the edge of the sidewalk just as the grinder spun down. She was red-faced, panting, her eyes bulging. You vandal," she sputtered. "You are destroying association property. The police are on their way. You are going to jail, Jack. You are going to prison." "I haven't destroyed anything," I said calmly, taking off my gloves. "I've merely disassembled a faulty mechanism. This gate was a safety hazard. The hinges were rigid." "It was locked!" she screamed, pointing at the padlock. "It was locked for a reason." "And look," I said, gesturing to the center of the gate. "It is still locked." I walked over to the gate. "Watch out, Linda. Safety hazard." I kicked the wooden blocks out from underneath. For a second, the gate stood there, defying gravity. Then, with a slow, majestic grace, the entire 10-foot wide iron structure tipped backward. Crash! It hit the manicured grass of the park with a thud that I felt in the soles of my boots. It lay there flat on the ground. The padlock was still perfectly attached, holding the two halves of the gate together securely. But the entryway? The space between the brick pillars? Wide open. "There," I said, dusting off my hands. "Much better airflow." Linda stared at the fallen gate. She stared at the open space. She stared at me. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. She was incapable of processing a world where the lock was intact, but the barrier was gone. You, Jack," Dave yelled from his lawn. "Looking good." "Thanks, Dave," I yelled back. Sirens wailed in the distance. They were getting closer. Fast. "You're done," Linda hissed, a vein throbbing in her forehead. "You are so done. That is destruction of property. That gate cost $5,000. "Actually," I said, checking my watch, "the gate is fine. It's just horizontal. The hinges, however, were clearly defective. I'm going to have to take those in for disposal." I walked over to the brick pillars. The hinge plates were still bolted to the brick, but the heavy brass and steel knuckles I had cut off were lying on the ground. I picked one up. It was hot. Heavy. Solid brass under the paint. "That's evidence!" Linda shrieked. "Put that down!" "It's scrap," I corrected. "And I'm cleaning up my work site." The police cruiser whipped around the corner, lights flashing, siren chirping. It pulled up right behind my truck. "Finally!" Linda yelled, throwing her hands up. "Arrest him! Arrest this maniac!" The car door opened. Officer Miller stepped out. I knew Miller. He was a guy who looked like he had seen everything, and was impressed by none of it. He adjusted his belt, looked at Linda, looked at me, looked at the giant angle grinder on the ground, and finally looked at the gate lying flat on the grass. He took a slow, deep breath. "All right," Miller said, walking over with the enthusiasm of a man walking to a root canal. "Who wants to tell me why there is a gate on the ground?" "He broke in!" Linda shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "He used a saw! He cut the gate down! He's breaking and entering! It's domestic terrorism!" Miller looked at me. "Domestic terrorism, Jack? Really?" "I prefer aggressive landscaping, officer," I said. Miller sighed and walked over to the gate. He crouched down and inspected the center. He tugged on the padlock. It held firm. "The lock seems fine, ma'am," Miller said. "He cut the hinges!" Linda screamed. "He cut the hinges off!" "The hinges were a safety hazard," I interjected quickly. "Bylaw 4.2, emergency repairs. They were seizing up. I feared the gate might fall on a child, so I preemptively removed the structural failure points. I was just about to haul the debris away." Miller looked at the cleanly cut hinge pins. He looked at the smooth, undamaged brickwork. He looked at the open park. "You cut the hinges," Miller said, keeping his face perfectly neutral, "to prevent the gate from falling." "By making the gate fall." "Controlled demolition," I clarified. "Safety first." Miller stood up. He looked at Linda. "Ma'am, did you see him touch the lock?" "No, but did he damage the brick pillars?" "That's not the point. Did he threaten you?" "He waved at me, menacingly." Miller rubbed his temples. "Okay, here's what I see. I see a civil dispute between a resident and an HOA board member regarding the maintenance status of a gate. I see no criminal damage to the locking mechanism. I see a gate that is currently not functioning as a gate." "Arrest him!" Linda demanded. "For what?" Miller asked. "The gate is still on the property. He hasn't stolen it. He hasn't broken the lock. If you want to sue him for the cost of the hinges, take him to small claims court. But this?" He gestured to the open park. "This isn't a police matter. This is a hardware disagreement." Linda looked like she was going to have a stroke. "I demand a report. I demand you cite him for something." Miller looked at me. He looked at the angle grinder. A tiny corner of his mouth twitched. I think he was suppressing a smile. "Jack," Miller said, "clean up your mess. Don't leave sharp metal on the ground." "Yes, sir," I said. "I was just loading it up." "And Linda," Miller turned to her, "if the park is closed, you might want to put up some caution tape, since you know there's no gate anymore." Miller got back in his car. He didn't even turn his lights on as he drove away. Linda stood there, vibrating with rage. She looked at the gate. She looked at me loading the heavy hinge pieces into the bed of my truck. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers." "Can't wait," I said, slamming the tailgate shut. "But hey, on the bright side, the park is open." I whistled for Buster. He came trotting out of the garage, ran straight through the open gateway, and immediately peed on the nearest tree. "Good boy," I said. I got in my truck. I had about 40 pounds of high-grade brass and steel in the back, and I knew exactly where I was going. I pulled out of the neighborhood with the kind of deliberate slowness that drives people crazy. I kept it exactly at 24 miles per hour, 1 mile under the speed limit, just in case Officer Miller decided to circle back, or Linda had a drone with a radar gun deployed. My truck bed rattled with the metallic clatter of victory. Every bump in the road sent a clank thud through the chassis, a heavy reminder of the 40 pounds of industrial hinge mechanisms I was currently transporting across county lines. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a strange, vibrating clarity. It's a specific feeling you only get when you've done something incredibly stupid, but technically legal. My hands were still buzzing from the grinder. I could still smell the ozone and the burning paint. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a convoy of HOA-branded tanks chasing me. But the road was empty. Just suburbia, calm and unaware that a revolution had just occurred at the corner of Oak and Elm. I wasn't going home yet. Going home meant explaining to my wife, Sarah, why the neighborhood Facebook group was currently exploding. Sarah was a woman of immense patience, but her tolerance for my projects had limits, and sawing down the community gate was definitely pushing the boundary of marital bliss. I needed an alibi. Or rather, I needed to complete the transaction to make my alibi airtight. If I just threw the hinges in a dumpster, I was a vandal. If I kept them, I was a thief. But if I sold them? If I sold them and documented the transaction? Then I was a responsible fiduciary liquidating assets. I drove out past the manicured lawns, past the strip malls with their identical coffee shops, and into the industrial district on the south side of town. The scenery changed rapidly. The beige stucco gave way to corrugated steel, chain-link fences topped with razor wire, and the pervasive smell of diesel and rust. I pulled into Sal's ferrous and non-ferrous, a scrapyard that looked like where optimism went to die. Piles of twisted rebar, crushed washing machines, and the skeletons of old cars created a jagged skyline against the afternoon sun. A massive crane with a magnetic claw was swinging in the distance, dropping a sedan onto a pile with a crunch that sounded like a giant stepping on a bag of chips. I parked the truck near the intake shed. A sign on the door read, "We buy copper, no questions asked, unless it's obviously stolen from a church." I grabbed the bucket from the back of my truck, loaded the warm, heavy hinge pieces into it, and walked inside. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke, old coffee, and grease. Sal was behind the counter, a man who was shaped roughly like a vending machine and possessed about the same emotional range. He was reading a newspaper that looked 3 days old. "Afternoon, Sal," I said, heaving the bucket onto the counter. The plastic cracked slightly under the weight. Sal didn't look up. "Copper's down. Aluminum's up. Steel is steel. I got a mixed bag today, Sal. Heavy iron, but I think the knuckles are brass, high quality." Sal finally lowered the paper. He looked at me, then at the bucket. He had eyes like ball bearings, hard, shiny, and unfeeling. He reached into the bucket and pulled out one of the severed hinge pins. He turned it over in his grease-stained hand. He saw the clean, bright cut where the diamond wheel had sliced through. "Fresh cut," Sal grunted. "Still warm." "Maintenance project," I said. Sal raised an eyebrow. It was a movement that shifted his entire forehead. "Maintenance? Looks like you maintained the hell out of it. This is inch-thick stock. What was this? A bank vault?" "HOA gate," I said. Sal stopped. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his face, revealing a gold tooth that was probably the most valuable thing in the room. He let out a laugh that sounded like a gravel truck shifting gears. "HOA? You cut up an HOA gate? They locked the park, Sal. I removed the obstruction." Sal laughed harder, slapping the counter. Dust flew into the air. "I hate those places. My cousin lives in one. They fined him for having a bird feeder that attracted aggressive squirrels. You stick it to him, kid?" I stuck it to him good. Officer Miller watched. Me leave. "Miller? Good cop. Lazy, but good." Sal threw the hinge back in the bucket. "All right, let's weigh this trophy." He dragged the bucket onto the scale. The digital red numbers flickered and settled. 42 pounds, Sal announced. Mostly steel, but that brass core, that bumps you up a tax bracket. Steel is going for 8 cents a pound. Brass is decent, but since it's mixed and I gotta separate it. He tapped a calculator with a finger the size of a sausage. I'm not looking to get rich, Sal. I just need a receipt. A legitimate, itemized receipt. Paper trail, huh? Smart. Sal punched a few keys. The ancient dot matrix printer in the corner whirred to life, screeching like a dying cat. I'll give you scrap rate plus the stick it to the man bonus. He ripped the paper off the machine and handed it to me along with a few crumpled bills and some coins. $12.40, Sal said. Don't spend it all on legal fees. I took the money. It felt heavy, significant. This wasn't just pocket change, this was the tangible proof of my compliance. Thanks, Sal. You're a patriot. Get out of here, Sal waved me off, picking up his paper. And bring me the rest of the gate when they sue you. I walked back to the truck, the receipt tucked safely in my wallet. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, just looking at the cash in my hand. A 10, 2 ones, and 40 cents. I drove home with the windows down. I stopped at a gas station and bought a Snickers bar with one of the dollar bills. It tasted like victory. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was starting to dip lower. The neighborhood was eerily quiet. I looked toward the park entrance. The gate was still down. It lay there on the grass, a dark, heavy monolith of defeat. No one had moved it. No one could move it. That thing weighed hundreds of pounds. The caution tape Officer Miller had suggested was nowhere to be seen, probably because Linda considered yellow tape to be tacky. Instead, there were just a few orange cones that looked like they had been stolen from a soccer practice, placed feebly around the wreckage. But the gap? The gap was glorious. 2 kids were currently walking their bikes through the open space where the Hinges used to be. They didn't even look at the fallen gate. They just walked into the park, free as birds. I parked the truck. I walked inside. Sarah was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a rhythmic intensity that suggested she had already seen the Nextdoor app. Hi, honey, I said, trying to sound casual. She didn't stop chopping. Jack? How was your day? Interesting, she said, slicing a bell pepper with surgical precision. My phone has been buzzing for 2 hours. Apparently there was a terrorist attack at the park entrance, involving a power tool? Terrorist is a strong word. I prefer volunteer maintenance technician. Sarah put the knife down. She turned to look at me. She tried to keep a stern face, but I saw the corner of her lip twitch. She hated the HOA almost as much as I did, ever since they told her she couldn't plant lavender in the front bed because it attracted bees. Is the gate gone? She asked. It's resting, I said. It's taking a nap on the lawn, but the park is open. She sighed, shaking her head, but she walked over and kissed me on the cheek. You're an idiot. A hero, maybe, but an idiot. Linda is going to burn this house down. Let her try, I said. I have a fire extinguisher and I know how to use the bylaws. Go wash up, she said. You smell like a welding accident. I went upstairs, but I didn't wash up immediately. I went to my office. I sat down at my computer. It was time for the final stroke of the masterpiece. The physical labor was done. Now it was time for the administrative violence. I opened my email client. I found the last email Linda had sent. The one with the subject line, urgent, park closure, and reminder of trash bin protocols. I hit reply all. This list included the entire board, the property management company, and for some reason about 200 residents who had never figured out how to unsubscribe. I cracked my knuckles. Subject: urgent, park closure, maintenance update and revenue. Submission: Dear board and neighbors, I am writing to provide an update regarding the safety hazard identified at the south entrance gate earlier today. As many of you noticed, the gate mechanism had seized, rendering the public easement inaccessible and creating a potential crushing hazard. Acting in accordance with Bylaw 4.2, Emergency Repairs to Common Elements, I performed the necessary on-site maintenance to alleviate the structural stress on the pillars. The defective hinge mechanisms were removed to prevent catastrophic failure. Per HOA regulations regarding the disposal of association assets, I have liquidated the scrap metal at a licensed recycling facility. I am pleased to report that we secured a competitive market rate. Attached, please find the receipt for the transaction in the amount of $12.40. I have deposited this amount into the community drop box in an envelope marked Gate Fund. Please apply these funds toward the purchase of new, functional hinges. I recommend a greasable ball-bearing model to avoid future seizing. In the meantime, the park is fully accessible. Enjoy the grass. Sincerely, Jack. I attached a scan of the receipt, the gritty, oil-stained receipt from Sal's. I hovered my mouse over the send button. I took a deep breath. Click. The whoosh sound of the email sending was louder than the angle grinder had been. I sat back and waited. The fallout was not immediate. It was a slow burn. For the first 20 minutes, silence. Then the first reply came. It was from Dave. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear safety goggles. Thanks, Jack. Then Mrs. Higgins. Is the park open for dogs again? My Fluffy needs to run. Then, a barrage of emails from neighbors I didn't even know. People who had been silently stewing for months about the lock. Finally. Great work. Can you look at the pool gate next? It squeaks. And then, finally, the response from Linda. It wasn't an email. It was a formal letter taped to my front door the next morning by a process server who looked like he regretted his career choices. Notice of violation. Unauthorized alteration of exterior elements. Fine. $500. I laughed. I took the letter, walked into my office, and framed it. I hung it right next to the receipt from Sal's. I contested the fine, of course. I requested a hearing. The hearing was scheduled for 3 months out because the board was currently restructuring. Rumor had it that the restructuring involved 3 board members resigning because they were tired of being yelled at by happy residents who loved the open park. But the best part? The absolute best part was the gate itself. You see, bureaucracy is a slow, lumbering beast. Linda wanted the gate fixed immediately. She called contractors, she called welders, she called fence companies. But here's the thing about Sparky Pete and guys like him. They talk. The story of the angle grinder had circulated through the local trade networks. Every contractor in town knew that the Oak Creek HOA was a nightmare client. They knew Linda screamed. They knew she didn't pay on time. And now they knew that there was a crazy guy with a DeWalt grinder who would just cut their work down if it wasn't up to code. So, the quotes came in high. Astronomically high. Asshole tax high. One contractor quoted them $12,000 to weld new hinges. Another said he couldn't get the parts for 6 months due to supply chain issues, the supply chain issue being that he didn't want to come here. So the gate stayed down. For a week, it lay on the grass. Then, the landscaping crew, who also hated Linda, moved it gently, to the side, leaning it against the brick wall so they could mow. It became a monument. A symbol. The gap remained. Every morning, I walked Buster. We walked right through the empty space between the pillars. I would look at the jagged, shiny metal where the hinges used to be, and I would smile. Sometimes I'd see Linda in her window. She stopped using the binoculars. She just stood there, staring, a defeated general watching the enemy parade through the breach. I stopped waving. I didn't need to wave. The open space spoke for itself. 1 month later, the board finally caved. They didn't fix the gate. They voted to indefinitely suspend the gate closure policy due to budgetary constraints regarding hardware replacement. They hauled the gate away on a flatbed. I sat on my porch and watched it go. It looked like a funeral procession for a tyrant. That evening, I walked down to the park with Sarah and Buster. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the liberated grass. There were kids playing tag. There was a guy throwing a frisbee. Dave was there with his pug, who was actually running, or at least trotting enthusiastically. Sarah took my arm. "You know," she said quietly, "you're still crazy." "I know," I said. "But," she squeezed my arm, "it is nice to not have to unlock a prison gate to see a tree." I reached into my pocket. I still had the change from Sal's. The 10 and the 1s were gone, spent on coffee and life. But I had kept the 40 cents. 2 quarters. I added a dime from my own stash. I rubbed the coins together. They clinked softly. I looked at the park. I looked at the neighbors talking and laughing, no longer separated by iron bars and yellow signs. I looked at Buster, rolling in the grass with a look of pure, unadulterated ecstasy on his face. I'd spent $500 on a fine, which I was still fighting. I'd risked arrest. I'd alienated the most powerful woman in the cul-de-sac. But, looking at that open space, it was the best $12.40 I ever made.